Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. The descent into the belly of the dying rogue planet was a slow and suffocating burial. Abigail Price, a human terraforming engineer, found herself locked within a descending containment elevator, plunging thousands of miles beneath the frozen crust of a world that had strayed from its sun millions of years ago. She was a prisoner of the Veil, the indigenous subterranean race that ruled this lightless rock. They were taking her down to the planet core, not for an interrogation, but for a front-row seat to the apocalypse. She was to witness the final judgment of humanity. High above, anchored in the dead orbit of this wandering planet, the last human refugee fleet waited in the void. 3 million human lives, trapped in decaying generation ships, were entirely unaware that the Veil had targeted them for complete annihilation. The elevator groaned as it sank deeper into the crushing atmospheric pressure of the mantle. Abigail stood flanked by 2 towering Veil guards. They did not speak, at least not in any way a human ear could perceive. The Veil communicated and established their brutal social hierarchy through thermal radiation and bioluminescence. The language of their empire was heat and light. To be a subordinate meant existing in the colder, dimmer spectrums. To be a ruler meant burning with the intensity of a dying star. For a lesser creature, or a human like Abigail, daring to look directly into the luminous visage of a high-ranking Veil was a fatal mistake. The sheer intensity of their biological radiation would instantly boil the retinas and scorch the meninges of the brain, inducing a blinding and agonizing death. "Keep your eyes firmly fixed on the floor, human," the guard on her right warned, its voice a jagged mechanical translation that scraped through the ambient heat. "When the doors open to the radioactive crystal hall, you will bow your head. If you lift your chin, you will burn. That is the only rule of survival down here." Abigail swallowed hard, feeling the thick, metallic taste of iron and sulfur coating her throat. She nodded, keeping her gaze pinned to the searing floor grates of the elevator. The heat down here was not merely environmental. It was physical, pressing against her skin like a solid wall, deep within her spinal column. Her cybernetic thermoregulation implant vibrated violently. The device emitted a sharp, rhythmic beep, flooding her auditory nerves with constant warnings. The ambient temperature was rapidly climbing past 50 degrees Celsius, entering the lethal threshold for standard human physiology. Her implant was working at maximum capacity, flushing synthetic coolant through her nervous system to prevent her organs from shutting down. The persistent beeping was a countdown to her own boiling point, yet she could not afford to panic. The elevator shuddered to a halt. The massive blast doors split open, revealing the grand entrance of the radioactive crystal hall. The ambient radiation immediately spiked, setting her spinal implant into a frenzy of frantic chimes. The guards stepped forward, their glowing silhouettes casting long, distorted shadows across the dark basalt floor. Abigail followed, her head bowed strictly downward, observing only the terrifyingly beautiful ground she walked upon. Despite the imminent threat of execution and the suffocating heat, Abigail felt a profound, almost intoxicating sense of wonder overriding her fear. She was a terraforming engineer, a master of planetary manipulation, and what she was walking into was the pinnacle of geological engineering. Her trained mind quickly analyzed the floor beneath her boots. It was not just stone. It was a hyperconductive crystalline matrix designed to harvest and channel the geothermal fury of the planet core. The Veil were not merely surviving in the depths of a frozen rogue world. They had turned the entire planet into a colossal, living engine. Through her peripheral vision, still careful not to look up, Abigail mapped out the intricate veins of superheated plasma flowing beneath the transparent crystal pathways. She recognized the staggering scale of the structural supports, pillars of dark matter and compressed carbon that held millions of tons of tectonic rock at bay. The engineering was flawless, brutal, and breathtaking. They were siphoning the very lifeblood of the planet to sustain their underground empire, utilizing thermodynamic cycles that human science had only theorized. Her implant beeped again, a shrill reminder of her fragile mortality in the face of this alien majesty. The guards roughly shoved her forward, forcing her toward the center of the hall, where the heat grew infinitely more oppressive. Abigail focused on breathing, forcing the synthetic coolant to circulate faster. She was walking toward the supreme authority of the Veil, the source of the overwhelming radiation that was slowly cooking the air around her. She knew the execution order for the human fleet was waiting at the end of this corridor. She knew looking up meant immediate blindness and death. Yet, the brilliant mind of the engineer could not help but be entirely mesmerized by the magnificent, terrifying machinery of the alien world that was about to wipe her species from the universe. The massive blast doors sealed shut behind her, instantly cutting off the mechanical groans of the descending elevator. The throne room was not an architectural space in any traditional human sense. It was a cavernous cathedral forged from compressed carbon and molten glass, designed to contain an impossible force. At the absolute epicenter, resting upon a raised dais of dark matter, sat Queen Kaelin of the Veil. The sovereign did not merely occupy the space. She actively warped the reality of it. A severe thermal distortion sphere enveloped her entire figure, causing the surrounding air to ripple, tear, and bend light. She glowed with the violent, turbulent luminescence of a dying red dwarf star. The visual distortion was so profoundly intense that her physical outline blurred into a constantly shifting corona of deep crimson and searing violet plasma. The sheer kinetic weight of the Queen's biological radiation hit the assembly like a physical shockwave. It was an oppressive, invisible gravity made of pure heat. Instantly, the massive Veil guards flanking Abigail collapsed heavily to their knees, their own bioluminescent patterns dimming into dull, submissive hues. Dozens of other high-ranking courtiers scattered along the periphery were already prostrated, their faces pressed firmly against the superheated obsidian floor grates. The environmental heat was designed to dominate, to literally force the weak into the dirt or burn them alive. Abigail felt the crushing pressure bearing down on her shoulders, a heavy blanket of fire trying to push her to the ground. The air temperature violently spiked to over 120 degrees Celsius in a matter of seconds. But then, her terraforming implant intervened, recognizing a catastrophic localized atmospheric shift that would result in immediate cellular death. The cybernetic node embedded at the base of Abigail's spine forcefully bypassed its standard passive cooling cycle. It violently hijacked her body's natural bioelectric field, projecting a micro-thin, phase-shifting thermal shield just millimeters above her epidermis, while the towering alien giants all around her groveled and scraped under the lethal heat of their ruler. Abigail remained perfectly standing, anchored securely in the thermodynamic tempest by a fragile bubble of stolen physics. Her mind raced at a phenomenal speed. Logically, she knew she should kneel. Biologically, she was acutely aware she was supposed to be dead. Yet, the cynical engineer within her found the entire situation profoundly absurd. Here was a highly advanced empire dictating social submission through raw, unfiltered thermodynamics. It was an incredibly inefficient use of energy, a primitive flex of brute power dressed up as divine right from the floor grates. The terrified guards hissed frantic warnings, their words vibrating violently through the deck plates, demanding she lower her head immediately. Instead, Abigail did the exact opposite. Time seemed to stretch into a viscous, unyielding fluid as she commanded her neck muscles to defy every single survival instinct embedded deeply within human DNA. Breaking every established protocol of interstellar diplomacy and fundamental biology. She slowly lifted her chin. She tilted her head back, opening her eyes fully, and stared directly into the blinding, fiery core of the sovereign. She looked right into the Queen's eyes. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely terrifying. Absolute suffocating silence swallowed the vast throne room. Even the ambient, rhythmic hum of the deep geothermal conduit seemed to hold its breath. High above them, the localized quantum translation matrix, a highly complex web of sensitive sensors designed to interpret the subtle heat fluctuations of the Veil language, suffered a massive cascade failure. A sharp, discordant screech echoed from the ceiling speakers as the system glitched heavily, utterly incapable of processing an action that had zero precedent in their entire recorded planetary history. A subordinate species did not look at the sun without burning. It was an impossible mathematical variable. The Queen slowly rose from her dark matter throne. The thermal distortion field flared outward aggressively, washing over the throne room and raising the ambient temperature to 150 degrees Celsius. The heat was now a tangible, heavy weapon, promising immediate vaporization to anything unprotected. Kaelin descended the obsidian steps, moving with the terrifying, silent grace of a solar flare. The superheated air practically screamed as her body displaced it. She stopped mere inches from Abigail's phase-shifting shield. The Queen's face was a masterpiece of lethal geometry, radiating a heat so pure it transcended the very concept of physical pain. When she finally spoke, the translation matrix violently rebooted, delivering her voice not as an audible sound, but as a heavy, vibrating pressure directly into Abigail's skull. It was a question carrying the crushing weight of an entire dying empire. "You dare look at me?" Abigail did not flinch. Her shield held strong, shimmering faintly in the negative space between them. She rapidly analyzed the towering sovereign standing before her. She did not see an alien monster. She did not see a ruthless tyrant demanding blind worship. Her highly analytical mind effortlessly stripped away the paralyzing fear and saw only the sheer, unadulterated perfection of an exothermic reaction housed perfectly within a sentient, biological vessel. It was the most magnificent physical phenomenon she had ever witnessed in her entire 35 years of life. It was a flawless tragedy of physics, terrifyingly beautiful and entirely doomed. A slow, genuine smile spread across Abigail's face. The heavy sarcasm in her internal monologue completely dissolved, replaced by a sense of pure, scientific reverence. She maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact. Because you are beautiful." The translated words rippled outward through the hall like a secondary kinetic explosion. A collective, paralyzing shock gripped the prostrated court. The sheer audacity of the statement was a conceptual earthquake that shattered their reality. For a fraction of a microsecond, the Queen's crimson corona spiked to a dangerous, blinding white, threatening to instantly overload Abigail's shield and turn her into drifting ash. But then, as abruptly as it had flared, the lethal radiation completely retracted. The oppressive thermal gravity vanished entirely, leaving the air merely sweltering instead of instantly deadly. Queen Kaelin stood perfectly still, the blinding light of her body dimming down to a manageable, soft glow. The sovereign tilted her head slightly, an alien gesture of profound recalculation. The absolute, unyielding authority in her gaze was suddenly replaced by something far more dangerous. It was curiosity, with a single, sharp wave of her glowing hand. Kaelin immediately canceled the execution order, choosing to spare the insolent humans simply because she had to know more. A sharp, sweeping gesture from the sovereign's luminous arm sent a silent, absolute command through the cavernous space. The prostrated guards and courtiers immediately scrambled backward, their bioluminescence dimming in total submission as they retreated toward the outer perimeter. Heavy obsidian blast doors groaned on their massive tectonic tracks, sliding shut with a resonant, booming thud that sealed the chamber completely. The automated lockdown mechanisms instantly engaged, locking the heavy magnetic bolts into place. The localized quantum translation matrix hummed down to a low standby frequency, securely isolating their audio feeds from the rest of the vast underground empire. They were entirely alone. The Grand Throne Room had been instantaneously transformed into an exclusive, highly pressurized radiation cell containing only a godlike alien monarch and a captive human engineer. Without a single spoken word, Kalen began a rigorous, deeply invasive, psychological and physical interrogation. She stepped closer, closing the distance until the gap between them was mere inches. The ambient temperature in the sealed room began to climb steadily and aggressively. 130 degrees Celsius, 140, 150. Abigail felt the fierce, mechanical resistance of her cybernetic implant fighting the onslaught, pumping synthetic coolant at maximum capacity, warning her that her biological limits were rapidly approaching. Instead of succumbing to the natural instinct of panic, the engineer's mind shifted into pure, cold, analytical overdrive. She recognized the specific thermal pattern not as a mindless, rage-fueled attack, but as a carefully calibrated stress test. Kalen was systematically probing the structural integrity of the human's defiance, searching for a physical or mental breaking point. Abigail matched the sovereign's escalation using advanced applied thermodynamics. She understood immediately that brute force or pure endurance would fail, so she relied on precise mathematical calculation. By subtly shifting her physical posture, altering her breathing rhythm, and maximizing the bioelectric output of her spinal node, she actively manipulated the phase-shifting shield protecting her body. She angled the micro-thin energy barrier to actively refract the incoming thermal waves, perfectly bouncing the lethal, concentrated heat back into the ambient atmosphere rather than attempting to absorb the kinetic impact. It was a flawless thermodynamic countermeasure, a silent, highly technical dance of physics where the human flawlessly neutralized the aliens' escalating power without taking a single aggressive step forward. She stood her ground, effectively turning the Queen's own overwhelming energy against the empty space around them. Because she held her defensive position so perfectly, Abigail was afforded a unique perspective no other living creature had ever managed to achieve without immediately burning to ash. Up close, the terrifying visual distortions surrounding the Queen began to resolve into a horrifying clarity. The blinding crimson corona was not a natural, healthy biological aura projecting supreme genetic dominance. It was fractured. Abigail's highly trained, analytical eyes tracked the microscopic, violent tremors ripping through the sovereign's translucent epidermis. Beneath the glowing alien skin, the complex biological energy pathways were not flowing with life-giving plasma. They were violently breaking apart at the subatomic level. The human engineer recognized the devastating thermodynamic signature instantly. It was uncontrolled nuclear fission. The Queen was not simply radiating excess heat as a majestic display of political power. She was actively detonating on a cellular level. The staggering, monumental truth hit Abigail like a physical blow, completely recontextualizing the entire existence of this formidable underground empire. The rogue planet was dying, its planetary core rapidly cooling into solid, lifeless iron. To prevent her entire species from freezing to death in the dark void of deep space, the Queen was using her own highly evolved biology as a desperate, living substitute reactor. She was forcibly sustaining the planetary core's temperature by slowly, agonizingly burning her own body alive in a constant state of localized atomic fission. The heavy, oppressive silence in the room hung thick, vibrating with the devastating weight of this profound, silent revelation. Abigail reached back to her neural interface and deliberately deactivated her translation matrix's polite diplomatic filter, opting for raw, unfiltered linguistic transmission to ensure her exact meaning was conveyed without any cultural misinterpretation. "You are not glowing with power," Abigail said, her voice steady, calm, and echoing clearly in the vast, sealed chamber without a single trace of fear. "You are dying. I am looking right at your cellular structure, and it is undergoing catastrophic degradation. You are acting as a biological control rod for a collapsing planetary core." The Queen halted her aggressive thermal escalation immediately. The violent, swirling red aura flickered, dimming just enough to reveal a brief flicker of profound exhaustion beneath the intimidating, impenetrable mask of a deity. For a fraction of a second, the terrifying alien ruler suddenly looked incredibly tired and overwhelmingly burdened. "Your perceived greatness is not actual authority," Abigail continued, her tone stripping away all the majestic titles and royal pretense that usually shielded the monarch from reality. "It is profound isolation. You are sitting on that dark matter throne, literally burning yourself alive for centuries, carrying the slow, inevitable death of your entire race on your shoulders just so they do not have to feel the creeping cold. And the worst part is, none of them even know the truth. They bow down to the floor because they fear your heat, but they cannot see that your terrifying heat is an act of ultimate, silent sacrifice." The bold words hung in the superheated air, a brutal, undeniable diagnosis of a monarch's deepest, most secret agony. For a long, stretched moment, spanning nearly 60 seconds, the Queen remained completely motionless. The quantum translation matrix crackled softly, attempting to process the profound, complex emotional shift occurring within the sovereign's mind. When Kaelin finally responded, the voice projected directly into Abigail's mind was no longer the crushing, authoritarian weight of an untouchable sovereign, but the weary, deeply resonant whisper of a fellow, exhausted survivor. "For 800 years, I have burned in the dark," Kaelin projected, her luminance dimming further to a sorrowful, muted amber hue. "My court sees only a blazing god to fear. They do not comprehend the complex, terminal mathematics of our impending extinction. You are a fragile, low-temperature organism from a drifting, primitive refugee fleet. Yet you stand before me and see the heavy truth that my own people are entirely blind to." Abigail nodded slowly, lowering her defensive posture slightly to signal a cessation of hostilities. "I am an engineer. My sole purpose in life is to keep struggling worlds alive. I know exactly what it costs to fight the void, and I know the terrible loneliness of making the hard calculations. In that sealed, radioactive tomb, the fundamental dynamic of their interaction shifted entirely. The invisible, impenetrable walls of species difference, hierarchical rank, and interstellar hostility simply evaporated. This was no longer a tense negotiation between a desperate captive and a ruthless executioner. It was a profound, unprecedented meeting of minds. It was a deep connection forged between two solitary leaders from entirely different universes. The Queen saw past the fragile human shell to the unbreakable will beneath it, realizing that Abigail was not challenging her reign, but finally validating her silent, excruciating martyrdom. They were bound together in that quiet moment by the terrifying, isolating burden of doing absolutely anything and enduring any amount of pain to ensure their respective people would live to see another tomorrow. The profound silence of their shared understanding shattered with the deafening roar of high-yield plasma charges. The massive obsidian blast doors, previously locked shut, violently exploded inward. Chunks of heavy magnetic bolts and shattered crystalline rock rained down across the throne room floor. Through the swirling black smoke and falling debris marched Warlord Zephyrin, the supreme commander of the Vale Extreme military faction, leading a heavily armed battalion of rebel soldiers. Unlike the Queen's muted amber glow, Zephyrin and his forces burned with a sickly, volatile green luminescence, heavily augmented by stolen core tap technology. "Look at what our mighty sovereign has become," Zephyrin bellowed, his voice amplified by a brutal translation matrix that echoed like thunder across the cavernous walls. "The supreme ruler of our empire, whispering in the dark with a primitive, low-temperature parasite. I have watched your light fade for decades. Kalen, I watched you hesitate, and now you spare the very vermin that pollutes our orbit. Your weakness has endangered us all." Kalen stood up, her aura instantly flaring back into a defensive crimson, but the effort clearly caused violent microscopic tremors beneath her skin. "Stand down, Zephyrin. You have absolutely no comprehension of the delicate thermodynamic forces currently keeping this frozen world alive. If you disrupt the primary stabilization matrix, you will kill every single citizen residing in the lower sectors." "I am saving them from your slow, pathetic death," Zephyrin retorted, raising his heavy, weaponized gauntlet. "By the ancient, unyielding laws of our ancestors, I hereby invoke the Overthrow Protocol. You are no longer fit to command the heat. I am taking absolute control of the mantle." Without waiting for a royal response, the warlord bypassed the throne room security network using a stolen, hardwired override sequence. He forcefully initiated the massive tectonic weapon system deep beneath their feet. The planetary core groaned a horrific, mechanical scream that vibrated up through Abigail's boots. The warlord was routing the hyperconductive plasma channels directly upward, aiming a concentrated beam of geological destruction straight at the orbital plane to completely wipe out the human refugee fleet. Simultaneously, he triggered a localized lockout, systematically stripping Kalen of her administrative control over the primary energy grid. The Queen lunged forward to physically sever his connection to the mainframe, but the sudden, violent exertion pushed her compromised cellular structure past its absolute limit. A sickening, bright white flash erupted from her right shoulder, a localized meltdown that forced her to her knees in agonizing pain. Her biological reactor was critically unstable. Launching a sustained counterattack would cause her body to undergo instantaneous, catastrophic liquefaction. She was entirely defenseless, trapped by her own failing biology. Seeing the sovereign fall helplessly, Zephyrin sneered. He leveled his heavy plasma gauntlet directly at her chest, aiming to finish the violent coup with a single, point-blank thermal execution. He pulled the heavy firing mechanism. A searing, condensed bolt of superheated green plasma erupted from the barrel, tearing through the sweltering air at supersonic speed. In that crucial fraction of a second, sheer instinct and cold engineering completely overrode human self-preservation. Abigail did not hesitate for even one moment. She threw herself directly into the lethal trajectory, launching her body between the fallen queen and the oncoming projectile. Her cybernetic spinal implant screamed in a high-pitched frequency completely beyond human hearing. It instantly detected the massive incoming thermal mass and forcefully overcharged her phase-shifting shield to 100% capacity. The green plasma bolt slammed brutally into the micro-thin barrier. Instead of shattering under the pressure, the advanced terraforming technology absorbed the colossal kinetic energy. Abigail felt her internal organs compress terribly under the tremendous impact, her ribcage vibrating violently with the shockwave. But she did not simply take the hit. Her shield matrix violently rechanneled the absorbed energy, instantly harmonizing it with the ambient crimson radiation leaking heavily from the wounded queen. The resulting physical reaction was completely devastating and entirely unprecedented in Vale history. The aggressive merging of human terraforming tech and alien nuclear biology triggered a massive, concussive explosion of blinding white light. A shockwave of pure kinetic force blasted outward in a perfect 360-degree radius. Warlord Zephyrin and his heavily armed rebels were violently thrown backward through the air, their thick armor scorching as they slammed brutally against the jagged obsidian walls. The blinding detonation temporarily scrambled their optical receptors, plunging the traitors into a panicked, severely disoriented state. Abigail fell heavily to the hot floor plates, gasping desperately for air as her implant forcefully rebooted its heavily damaged cooling cycle. She had successfully repelled the immediate assassination attempt, but the hard-fought victory was terrifyingly short-lived. A deep, catastrophic rumble began to tear through the very foundation of the throne room. The massive floor grates cracked wide open, violently venting huge plumes of highly radioactive steam into the enclosed space. Zephyrin's reckless activation of the tectonic weapon system, combined with the chaotic kinetic shockwave of the light explosion, had fundamentally fractured the primary stabilization conduit beneath them. High above their heads, the grand ceiling of compressed carbon began to spiderweb with glowing, terrifying fissures. Automated emergency alarms blared from every single terminal, shrieking in a frantic, terrifying cadence. The mechanical translations flashed wildly across the holographic displays, displaying a single, doom-filled message. The planetary core was officially destabilized. Warlord Zephyrin had completely broken the massive machine keeping them all alive. And now, the rogue planet was entering an irreversible process of total geological collapse. The physical structure of the Grand Throne Room began to violently disintegrate. Colossal slabs of the compressed carbon ceiling collapsed, crashing onto the shattered floor with deafening tectonic roars. Deep, jagged fissures tore rapidly through the obsidian ground, violently vomiting thick, sluggish streams of highly radioactive magma into the sweltering air. The rogue planet was screaming, its structural integrity completely compromised by the reckless weapon activation. Warlord Zephyrin dragged himself out of the rubble, his armor severely scorched and his green luminescence flickering erratically. He looked at the apocalyptic devastation he had unleashed, and pure, cowardly terror completely replaced his revolutionary zeal. "Abandon the lower sectors!" Zephyrin commanded his surviving rebels, his voice trembling as he scrambled toward the ruined blast doors. "Get to the atmospheric shuttles immediately. We are evacuating to the orbital staging grounds. Let the billions in the lower mantle burn." He did not look back. He sprinted for the hangar bays, entirely willing to leave the entire population of the Vael Empire to face a horrifying, fiery extinction while he secured his own pathetic survival. As the traitor fled, a sharp, metallic static buzzed forcefully deep within Abigail's auditory nerve. It was an encrypted tight beam transmission, piercing through the atmospheric interference, sent directly from the human refugee fleet anchored high above. "Engineer Price, this is Fleet Command." The desperate human voice echoed inside her skull. "Sensors detect a catastrophic localized core collapse. The rogue planet is fracturing. We are initiating our quantum jump sequence in exactly 3 minutes. A rapid extraction pod is waiting for your telemetry. You must evacuate the surface immediately or you will be caught in the planetary detonation." The human fleet was terrified and preparing to tear a hole in space and time to flee into the deep void. Abigail stood on a crumbling ledge of obsidian, staring down into the rising tide of radioactive lava. She was a terraforming specialist. Her entire life was dedicated to building worlds, not abandoning them to the ashes. She actively silenced the incoming transmission. She chose to stay. Her highly trained mind shifted into pure quantum mechanical processing. The cybernetic terraforming node fused to her spinal column was not just a defensive shield generator. It was an advanced, planetary-scale defragmentation tool. If she could interface with the central geothermal mainframe of the vial, she could mathematically force a thermodynamic reversal protocol. She could command the runaway tectonic plates to realign and forcefully vent the excess pressure back into the dormant outer crust. It was theoretically possible to completely halt the collapse and reverse the destruction. However, a massive, fatal variable immediately presented itself. Abigail pulled up her internal diagnostic interface. The violent kinetic blast she had absorbed to save the Queen had severely depleted her energy reserves. Her core battery was sitting at a pathetic 2%. The reboot protocol required an astronomical surge of pure, unfiltered bioelectric voltage to bridge the massive gap between her human technology and the alien planetary machinery. A standard synthetic battery would take thousands of years to generate that much power. She needed a living star. Abigail slowly turned her head to look at Queen Kaelin. The sovereign was still kneeling on the fractured dais, her crimson light flickering violently as her body desperately tried to contain the runaway nuclear fission destroying her cells. The Queen was a walking, dying reactor. Her neural network held more raw energy than 100 human dreadnoughts. "I can stop the mantle from cracking," Abigail shouted over the deafening roar of the rising magma. "My spinal node possesses the specific quantum algorithms required to override your broken stabilization systems. But my device is completely empty. I need raw power to jumpstart the planetary core, and you are the only battery large enough to supply it." Kaelin looked up, her glowing eyes locking onto the fragile human. "You are asking to merge your nervous system with mine," the Queen projected, her telepathic voice heavy with profound sorrow and deep dread. "That is the ultimate biological taboo. To bridge a human mind with a vile neural network in active fission will cause an unprecedented sensory overload. The sheer volume of quantum data and thermal feedback will instantly vaporize your cognitive pathways. The mortality rate for such an integration is 99%. It is absolute, certain death. And it is a 100% mortality rate for your billions of citizens if we do absolutely nothing." Abigail fired back, her voice entirely devoid of hesitation. "I am an engineer, and I am telling you the math works. If we synchronize our bioelectric fields, my hardware can channel your runaway nuclear energy directly into the core matrix without melting your physical body. I will act as your biological grounding wire. We can save this world." The ground beneath them shuddered violently, throwing them both off balance as another massive section of the throne room completely collapsed into the magma sea. The heat was now suffocating, pushing far past the limits of Abigail's failing shield. Time had entirely run out. Queen Kaelin slowly pushed herself off the burning floor. The sovereign shed every trace of royal pride, leaving only a desperate, grieving protector willing to sacrifice everything for her people. She extended her fiercely glowing, superheated hand towards the fragile human engineer. "If we fail, our minds will burn together in the dark," the Queen stated, a profound, terrifying finality echoing in the telepathic projection. Abigail stepped forward, completely ignoring the shrill, frantic alarms screaming from her failing temperature regulators. She looked directly into the terrifying beauty of the dying alien star. "Then let us burn," Abigail replied, throwing aside every single political, biological, and historical barrier that had kept their two species violently apart. The human engineer reached out and firmly grasped the burning hand of the alien queen. They prepared to initiate the most dangerous quantum connection in the history of the universe, diving willingly into the abyss of certain death to drag two entirely different civilizations back into the light. The moment their flesh met, the physical universe seemed to tear at the seams. Abigail Price clamped her hand around the superheated fingers of Queen Kaelin, and an incandescent shockwave of pure, blinding white energy instantly obliterated the shadows of the crumbling throne room. This was not a mere transfer of power. It was a violent, transcendent collision of two entirely different evolutionary paths. The human terraforming node at the base of Abigail's spine shrieked as it was flooded with the raw, unfathomable voltage of a dying biological star. It forcefully bridged the impossible gap, forging a direct quantum tether between the complex human nervous system and the highly volatile alien neural network. A catastrophic thermal storm ripped through Abigail's veins. For a fleeting, terrifying second, she felt the agonizing sensation of her own blood threatening to boil. But the implant held firm, instantly translating the lethal heat into pure data and memory. Suddenly, Abigail was no longer just standing in a ruined hall. Her consciousness violently expanded, swept away in a torrential flood of alien history. She felt the crushing, suffocating weight of thousands of years of solitary rule. She experienced firsthand the Queen's profound, agonizing loneliness, the silent centuries spent slowly burning away her own life force just to keep her subjects from freezing in the endless dark. It was a burden so immense it threatened to shatter the human engineer's mind. Simultaneously, the vast, ancient consciousness of the Veil Sovereign crashed headlong into the fragile human psyche. Kaelin had expected to find terror, weakness, and a primitive fear of the dark. Instead, the Queen's mind was completely overwhelmed by the breathtaking magnitude of human resilience. She felt Abigail's fierce, unyielding will to survive, a burning compassion that defied all logic, and the profound, deeply ingrained instinct to build, to heal, and to protect. The alien monarch realized that this tiny, fragile creature possessed a spirit infinitely hotter and brighter than any dying red dwarf star. They were no longer two isolated beings fighting a desperate war of survival. They had become a single, unified entity of immense purpose. With their minds perfectly synchronized, the true potential of the terraforming technology was finally unleashed. The cybernetic implant actively harnessed the runaway nuclear fission, destroying the Queen's cellular structure, drawing the devastating energy out of her biological pathways, and converting it into a stabilized, hyperdense thermodynamic beam. Abigail channeled this colossal, unified force downward, firing it directly through the shattered obsidian floor and straight into the dead, cooling heart of the rogue planet. The planetary core absorbed the monumental bioelectric charge. Deep beneath the mantle, the dormant magnetic field roared back to life with a deafening, global tectonic boom. The catastrophic geological collapse reversed entirely. The wild, runaway pressure within the magma chambers was mathematically recalculated and forcefully vented back into safe, stable subterranean reserves. The devastating nuclear reactions that were tearing the surface apart were instantly cooled, neutralized by the flawlessly executed quantum algorithm. The rebirth of the planetary core generated an immense, invisible electromagnetic shockwave that swept upward through every single layer of the planet. It burst through the crust and rushed into the upper atmosphere with the force of 1,000 hurricanes. High above the surface, Warlord Zephyrin had just boarded his escape shuttle, fully prepared to leave his entire civilization to burn. The EMP shockwave hit his vessel squarely, instantly and permanently frying every single propulsion drive and weapon system on board. His craft fell dead on the launch pad, completely neutralized. Simultaneously, the massive tectonic artillery aimed at the human refugee fleet was forcefully powered down and locked out by the newly stabilized planetary mainframe. Down in the ruined throne room, the blinding quantum light slowly began to fade. The overwhelming thermal gravity dissipated, leaving the air cool and breathable for the first time in centuries. Abigail and Kaelin collapsed heavily onto the fractured ground. Their bodies were completely exhausted, drained of every ounce of energy, yet their hands remained fiercely locked together. Abigail blinked through the settling dust, looking over at the alien sovereign. The terrifying, distorted thermal aura that had surrounded Kaelin was completely gone. Her translucent skin was no longer tearing itself apart at the subatomic level. The human terraforming technology had successfully stabilized her biological reactor, completely healing the Queen from her lethal, centuries-long nuclear fission. The heavy, reinforced doors of the outer chamber slowly groaned open. The surviving Veil guards and courtiers crept back into the ruined hall, their bioluminescence flickering with absolute awe. They stood entirely paralyzed by the impossible sight before them. A fragile human had not been incinerated by the wrath of their god. Instead, she had assimilated with the sovereign, sharing the ultimate burden to save their entire kingdom from ashes. Queen Kaelin slowly raised her head, her natural, healthy amber glow radiating a warm, gentle light across the shattered room. She projected her voice, not just to the courtiers present, but broadcasting her decree across the entire stabilized planetary grid. "The execution order for the human fleet is permanently abolished," the sovereign declared, her tone echoing with newfound vitality and absolute clarity. "We will no longer hide in the dark, and we will no longer rule through the terrifying weight of fire. Open our skies. We shall forge a new alliance, sharing our deep geothermal refuge in exchange for their terraforming mastery." As the human engineer helped the alien queen to her feet, the history of two desperate species was forever rewritten, proving undeniably that a connection forged in the fires of true empathy will always burn brighter than the cold, dark grip of fear. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Sci-fi stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.